There are things politicians say on camera, and there are things that actually happen. In the spring of 2026, several events passed almost unnoticed beneath the noise of war. King Carl XVI Gustaf of Sweden visited Kyiv. King Charles III of the United Kingdom visited Donald Trump, not in Washington, as protocol would normally dictate, but at the White House itself, in a gesture that broke every diplomatic convention. Against the backdrop of military dispatches from Ukraine and the Middle East, these events seemed like society page filler. Protocol, formality, but what if they were not protocol at all? What if kings appeared precisely where those who shape history must appear, at the moment when history has not yet been written? This investigation is an attempt to read a game that no one announced out loud. We do not assert, we ask questions, and sometimes questions speak louder than answers. Carl XVI Gustaf is a constitutional monarch. He reigns but does not rule. Under Sweden's 1974 instrument of government, the king is stripped of virtually all political authority. He opens parliamentary sessions, receives ambassadors' letters of credence, presents the Nobel Prizes. He is a symbol. Symbols do not travel to war zones without reason. The official explanation arrived immediately, an expression of solidarity. Sweden, which joined NATO in 2024, was demonstrating commitment to its alliance obligations. Beautiful words. Correct words. Precisely the kind of words one uses when one wants journalists to write about something else. But let us look at the context. Spring 2026. Peace negotiations had entered yet another dead end. The American administration was pushing Kyiv toward talks, demanding flexibility. European allies were divided. Some still pressed for total victory. Others had begun to waver, convinced that the war in the Middle East had fundamentally altered the calculus, that more realistic objectives were needed. And it was precisely at this moment that a monarch arrived in Kyiv, not a president, not a prime minister, not the head of an international organization. A king. Why send a king when a minister would have sufficed? Sweden had been proud of its neutrality for centuries. It had not fought a war since 1814. It created the Red Cross, sheltered refugees, established the Nobel Peace Prize. Neutrality was not merely a policy, it was a national identity. And then that neutrality was discarded. In the trash. With a single parliamentary vote. This means those who made that decision saw something that outweighed 200 years of history. Or, someone very persuasively explained to them what they needed to see. Sweden inside NATO transforms the Northern European balance fundamentally. This is not simply one more country in the alliance. It is control over the Baltic Sea, which in any conflict becomes NATO's internal lake. For Russia, this is an existential matter: access to the Baltic, to Kaliningrad, to Western trade routes. Carl XVI Gustaf signed the instruments of his country's NATO accession. His government made that decision, without his political will, perhaps, but with his symbolic participation. And now he travels to Kyiv. Coincidence? Perhaps. But in high politics there are no coincidences. Only events that have not yet received their explanation. A monarch in diplomacy is a special instrument. He bears no political responsibility in the way an elected official does. He can hold a conversation that will never appear in any protocol. He can transmit a signal that will never surface in any official communique. This is precisely why monarchs are sometimes used for contacts that are too sensitive for official channels. This is called quiet diplomacy. It did not vanish in the 21st century, it simply learned to hide behind press releases. So, what exactly could the Swedish king convey to Zelensky that the Swedish foreign minister could not? We do not know. Nobody knows, at least, nobody who is willing to speak publicly. But there is one topic that was actively discussed during this period in closed diplomatic corridors, in the think tanks of Brussels and Washington. A topic so unorthodox that it was not spoken aloud. The topic of Ukraine's future political structure after the war. Among the various scenarios being considered by Western strategists, there was one, so radical that its very discussion is a sensation. A scenario in which the Ukrainian state preserves its identity, receives long-term neutrality guarantees, but changes its form of government. becomes a constitutional monarchy. Zelensky becomes king. Real power transfers to parliament. No, this is not fiction. This is a working hypothesis that circulated in certain circles. And it is precisely this hypothesis that, possibly, the king of a constitutional monarchy traveled to Kyiv to discuss. Who better knows how this works, how a monarch reigns without governing, how a state functions without one man making all the decisions? The man who has done exactly that his entire life. Donald Trump and Charles III. This was not the meeting analysts expected to see. Not the meeting described in standard diplomatic textbooks. A Republican president, skeptic of monarchy and tradition, and a British king who embodies those very traditions. And yet they met, and the meeting ran behind closed doors considerably longer than the official protocol anticipated. What do a president and a king discuss when the cameras are off? Trump is a man of symbols and brands. For him, monarchy is not an anachronism, it is power with a capital P. It is something he understands and respects. Authority expressed through architecture, ceremony, history. Charles III may be the only European leader capable of speaking with Trump in this language, the language of greatness. This is not merely public relations. It is a strategy of communication. The official communiques following the meeting were strikingly sparse. Words about important bilateral relations, about transatlantic partnership, about shared values. The standard set of diplomatic incantations, which usually means either that nothing specific was decided, or that specifics exist but will not be disclosed. The timing, however, is intriguing. The visit took place during a period when the American administration was actively seeking formats for resolving the Ukrainian crisis that would not appear to be capitulation. A period, moreover, when the small victorious war in the Gulf was looking increasingly less victorious, raising serious questions about America's ability to impose its will even on second-tier states. Trump had publicly declared he wanted a deal, but a deal means compromise. And a compromise with Russia is toxic for European allies. If someone can convince Europe that a particular deal format is acceptable, and do so without it appearing to be pressure from Washington, without it looking like American diktat, then that someone must stand outside the normal political hierarchy, must possess an authority that surpasses any elected office. Who in Europe stands above an elected office? The man who was never elected to one. Great Britain signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, the document under which Ukraine surrendered its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantees. In retrospect, it was a flawed instrument from birth. After the Euromaidan, when a government came to power waving EU and NATO flags, it became clear that without a genuinely neutral Ukraine, the memorandum functioned less as a security guarantee than as a declaration of confrontation. But the reputational consequences remain. London bears a share of moral responsibility for what has followed, and London knows it. Beyond that, and this matters more, Great Britain post-Brexit is desperately searching for a role. A geopolitical role that it lost first with the dissolution of empire, and then, when it lost its seat at the European table, shrank further still. Ukraine has become that role. British military advisors, British weapon systems, British diplomacy, all of it working to project the image of global Britain. A Britain that matters again. Charles III is not merely a symbol. He is the embodiment of that image. When he meets with Trump, he is not simply drinking tea. He is transmitting a message. Britain is here. Britain matters. Listen to Britain, it has a plan. But there is another layer. A more personal one. Charles III spent his entire life waiting for his moment. He became king at 73, later than any British monarch in history. He has ideas. He has views on the world order, unconventional views on climate, on architecture, on the role of monarchy in the modern age. And he has limited time to see those views realized. What if among those views is a conception of what post-conflict settlement in Eastern Europe should look like? And what if he decided to use his meeting with Trump to advance that conception? Kings sometimes think in generations. Politicians think only until the next election. By spring 2026, the war in Ukraine had reached what military strategists call a durable stalemate. Neither side could win. Neither side could afford to officially lose. Negotiations were happening, and not happening. Each of the key players had their own particular impasse. Zelensky. Ending the war meant ending martial law. Martial law provided emergency powers, presidential decrees in place of legislation, the National Security Council in place of courts, elections postponed indefinitely. Without the war, all of that would disappear. And with it, protection from competitors, Zelensky, Budanov, and dozens of others who also want power, who can also appeal to military credibility. Beyond that, and this is more serious, in peacetime would begin what would have begun long ago in any other country: investigations. Corruption scandals that, by unhappy coincidence, had begun closing in on the presidential office itself, frozen now under the pretext of wartime necessity. Those would thaw. And no one knows what lies beneath that ice. Russia. Moscow wanted Ukraine's neutrality enshrined in law. Not merely words, but constitutional norms, on the Austrian model of 1955. No NATO, no foreign military bases, no Western missiles near its borders. But this was precisely what the West refused to provide, because it would have looked like a victory for Putin. The West, Washington and Brussels offered Ukraine security guarantees, something resembling Article 5 of NATO, but without NATO membership itself. A convenient construction that Russia read as NATO de facto in the absence of NATO de jure. This, formal absence with actual presence, was precisely what was unacceptable to Moscow. This was not merely a diplomatic impasse. It was a structural trap from which there was no exit through conventional negotiating mechanisms. Volodymyr Zelensky has traveled a path that almost no one in modern political history has traveled. He is the perfect embodiment of the postmodern man, of politics conducted through television and social media. From stand-up comedian to symbol of national resistance. From a man no one took seriously to a man received by Congress and the United Nations General Assembly. But behind this journey lies a simple human problem: he is trapped. If the war continues, Ukraine is destroyed, people die, the economy collapses. If the war ends, Zelensky loses the protection of emergency powers and risks losing everything else as well. This is an existential trap. There is no exit through conventional politics. Conventional politics assumes that after defeat, a politician moves to the opposition. But when the stakes are criminal charges, assets, family, no rational person looks for a conventional exit. And it is precisely here, at this point of personal impasse, that the unorthodox proposal emerges, the one that circulated in closed analytical circles. A proposal that may seem insane at first reading, and logical at second. What if Zelensky becomes not president but monarch? Not in a metaphorical sense. In the literal one, constitutional monarch of a neutral Ukraine that receives security guarantees, real guarantees, secured not by paper signatures but by the strategic interests of the guarantors, in exchange for the status of a state belonging to no military bloc. Monarch, for life. Sacred, beyond political competition, with immunity, with the historical legitimacy of the founding father of the neutral nation. And real power, to parliament, to the Verkhovna Rada, to those who are elected. From the standpoint of resolving Zelensky's personal dilemma, the construction is flawless. A golden parachute in the shape of a crown. The wartime president becomes a historical monarch. This is not defeat, it is transformation. Not, he left, but, he ascended. And beyond that, it removes the chief personal fear. A monarch is inviolable. A monarch is the state. Investigations against a monarch are investigations against statehood itself. Such things are not done. But here the construction collides with an insurmountable obstacle. Russia demands Austrian-style neutrality, constitutional, rigid, without Western military presence. The West agrees to neutrality only with a caveat: security guarantees that are functionally equivalent to NATO membership. These are not merely different positions at a negotiating table. They are mutually exclusive demands. Monarch, king, president, the form of government is irrelevant if there is no answer to the core question: what exactly is Ukrainian neutrality? A void between two blocks, or a new format for Western military infrastructure under a different name? It is here that Belgium enters the discussion, and here that it reveals its weakness as an analogy. Belgium's 1831 neutrality was violated not because Germany wanted to annex Belgium. Germany wanted to reach Paris. Belgium simply stood in the way. Germany issued an ultimatum demanding free passage through Belgian territory and invaded only 2 days later. But more importantly, by 1914, the Belgian General Staff had been secretly coordinating with its British and French counterparts for years. Neutrality was the declaration, underneath which a bloc alignment was already in place. This is the direct parallel to what Moscow sees in present-day Ukraine. A country that calls itself neutral, but whose military instructors, doctrines, and command systems are already integrated into NATO. A neutral Ukraine, like pre-1914 Belgium, is a Ukraine neutral on paper and Western in fact. Russia sees this, and this is precisely why no monarch, no elegant constitution will change the Kremlin's fundamental position, until there is an answer to the question of military status. But to understand why the Ukrainian conflict is so difficult to resolve, one must step outside geopolitics. Outside oil, gas, territories, and military blocs. And look at what lies deeper. Ukraine is a state within which two conceptions of statehood are at war. And this war did not begin in 2022, nor in 2014. It has been running since the 19th century. The first conception is romantic. The state as the embodiment of the national spirit. Blood, language, myth, history. The Cossack freedom. The Ukrainian language as sacred code. Membership in the community, through origin, not through a document. The cult of heroes. The sense of the pack. The second conception is enlightenment. The state as a contract among equal citizens. The rule of law, equality before the court regardless of language or origin. Membership in the community, through individual choice, through citizenship, not through blood. Society held at a distance from the state. The carriers of the first conception are primarily rural Ukraine and Western Ukraine, people recently arrived in cities, bringing with them a village and small-town identity, seeking their anchor in ethnic belonging. The second conception belongs to a narrow educated layer of urban intelligentsia, professionals, people oriented either toward Europe or toward Russia. These two worlds have coexisted in a single state, periodically breaking into acute conflict. 2013-14 was not the beginning of this conflict, it was its most acute phase, surfaced at last. The portion of society oriented toward Russia was effectively stripped of political representation and squeezed out of public life through violence. The portion oriented toward Europe came to power, but without broad popular support, and therefore compelled to constantly mimic ethno-nationalists, adapting to the code the masses understood. For the pro-European elite, the contradiction has never resolved. They feel themselves to be a kind of Euro-nomenklatura, their power owed not to the people they manipulate through media, but to European institutions that guarantee their place in the power structure. Like Soviet nomenclature, they built their careers on loyalty to the party, not to the people. To maintain their grip on power, they must permanently press the accelerator of nationalism. The war with Russia from 2022 temporarily sutured the internal rupture, by creating a single external enemy. But it did not eliminate the underlying contradiction. It waits in the depths, occasionally flaring to the surface. It is in this context that the idea of constitutional monarchy acquires a different dimension. The monarch is not merely a solution to Zelensky's personal problem. It is an attempt at an architectural synthesis of the two conceptions of statehood. The monarch embodies the romantic principle. He is the sacred symbol of the nation, the spirit of the people, the living embodiment of history and myth. He needs no appeal to language, he himself is the incarnation of the community. The chieftain who personalizes the popular mass. Parliament embodies the Enlightenment principle. Elected authority, law, equality, procedure, the search for compromise. This is not an invention. It is the British model, the Scandinavian model. It is precisely this model that enabled Great Britain, Sweden, and Norway to preserve national identity without sacrificing civic institutions. It is what reconciled romantics and rationalists, by giving each their own. And here, perhaps, the visits of two kings acquire a different meaning. Karl XVI Gustav travels to Kyiv not simply as a head of state expressing solidarity. He travels as the living embodiment of a model that might become the exit. His presence is not words. It is a demonstration. This is what it looks like. This is how monarchy functions in a modern European state. This is why it need not be frightening. Charles III meets with Trump not simply as an ally. He meets as a man who understands the language of symbolic power, and who can explain to the American president why a particular format of settlement makes sense not only for Ukraine, but for the global architecture of security. Possibly, only possibly. In high politics, the public figures, Zelensky, Putin, Trump, kings and prime ministers, are the actors. The visible part of the performance. But every performance has a director. And the director rarely takes a bow. Who generates ideas of this magnitude, the reconfiguration of the constitutional order of the largest country in Europe? Who translates these ideas into concrete diplomatic moves? Who arranges the visits of monarchs? This is the world of think tanks, of quiet advisors, of people whose names never appear in the news, but whose memoranda are read by those who make history. In this world circulate ideas that society sometimes learns about a year later, sometimes 10 years later, after they were first formulated. The war in Ukraine is too important a crisis not to become the subject of the most radical strategic thinking, of a willingness to abandon templates that no longer work. The facts that underlie this investigation are part of exactly that thinking. An analytical construction of the optimal exit, as one might formulate it. Not a description of reality. A description of what reality could be. The difference between those two things is sometimes very small. Donald Trump thinks in deals. For him, any international conflict is ultimately a negotiation with a buyer, a seller, and a price. Ukraine is no exception. Trump wanted to stop the war quickly. It was his campaign promise. But quickly does not mean at any cost. He needed a deal he could sell to the American audience as a victory. Not a capitulation, not a retreat, a victory. The problem? Any real compromise with Russia looks like a retreat. Because Russia challenges the American world order, a world built on the premise that America writes the rules others must follow. If the smallest crack appears in that construction, others, and above all China, will want to widen it. The world by our rules is also the narrative through which European elites tightly control public opinion in their own countries. But what if the deal format is unorthodox? What if, instead of, we surrendered territory, and the empire retreated before a country with the GDP of Spain, as Obama once put it, instead, we created a new state formation that resolves the underlying contradictions, both within the country and within the global security system? What if the victory looks not like retreat but like historical innovation? And what if, as part of the package, Russia's consent to an analogous solution could be secured for Belarus as well, offering Lukashenko his own crown? For a man with a branding mind, this is an entirely different conversation. And it is precisely this conversation that may have taken place behind closed doors. Russia's position is consistent, if one does not reduce it to, Putin wants war. Moscow declares 3 requirements: demilitarization, denazification, and neutrality. The first 2 are largely matters of degree. There is room for bargaining and compromise on both sides. The third is substantive: yes or no. Neutrality for Russia means Ukraine outside NATO legally and factually. No Western military bases. No ground-to-ground weapons systems capable of reaching Moscow. No exercises on Ukrainian territory involving NATO troops. This requirement is comprehensible from the logic of security, regardless of how one evaluates the Russian position. States have security interests, and Russia's interests in this case are formulated very concretely. The question, can a neutral Ukraine with a constitutional monarchy and parliamentary governance provide a sufficient answer to these demands? The answer, only if neutrality means the same thing to all parties. And it is precisely here that the chasm yawns open. In the 20th century there was one country that managed to exit a geopolitical confrontation through constitutional neutrality. Austria. In 1955, Soviet troops withdrew from eastern Austria, in exchange for the adoption of a constitutional law on permanent neutrality. Austria committed to joining no military alliances and to allowing no foreign military bases on its territory. It worked. Austria became a neutral state, and remained one throughout the Cold War. Today it is a member of the European Union, but not NATO. Vienna became the seat of international organizations, the UN, the IAEA, the OSCE. The Austrian model is the only real historical precedent for successful neutrality at the center of Europe during an era of bloc confrontation. It is precisely this model that those discussing the Ukrainian scenario invoke. But with one fundamental difference. In 1955, the USSR and the United States agreed. Both consented to withdraw their forces. Both recognized Austrian neutrality. Today, there is no agreement. There is no readiness on both sides to recognize neutrality as real neutrality. And this is what makes the Ukrainian case fundamentally different. Moscow carries bitter experience. Finland, which paid no substantial territorial price for its participation alongside Nazi Germany in the Second World War, treated its treaty of neutrality like a scrap of paper the moment it joined NATO. There is the experience of the Minsk agreements, which Moscow understood as a mechanism for neutralizing Ukraine, and which Angela Merkel later admitted the West had used only as time to buy time to rearm Ukraine. And there were the promises of not 1 inch eastward, given to Moscow in exchange for its consent to German reunification. Trust is now the most expensive commodity in the world. It cannot be purchased, it must be grown over years, over decades. And right now, there is almost none left. The most likely scenario is the most uncomfortable for everyone: the war continues. Slowly, expensively, endlessly, like Korea, where the armistice of 1953 has still not become a peace treaty. The line of contact is fixed de facto, not de jure. And everyone pretends this is temporary. For Ukraine, this means slow exhaustion. Demographic, economic, psychological. For Russia, sanctions pressure that gradually restructures its economy but does not break it. For Europe, endless expenditure on supporting Kyiv and endless risk of escalation. For the United States, yet another war that does not end, in conditions where resources are insufficient even for Iran, to say nothing of China. And if you show weakness once, everyone begins demanding their share. America, let us take the wheel. The concept of the unipolar planet faces collapse. This is the stable equilibrium of pain. An equilibrium in which no one feels enough pain to yield. Hence the European prescription: intensify Russia's pain. That is the only path to peace. Even if the patient Ukraine does not survive to see it, or emerges from it in the condition of Somalia, a territory controlled by warlords, a kind of brigade land. This is precisely why unorthodox ideas appear on the table. This is precisely why kings travel to war zones and meet with presidents. Because the standard solutions are exhausted. Because someone must think differently. It is difficult to prove that the visits of 2 kings in 2025 were part of a single diplomatic project. Difficult to prove that the idea of a Ukrainian constitutional monarchy was discussed behind closed doors. There is no proof, because this is precisely how quiet diplomacy is constructed. But one can ask, why did a constitutional monarch, stripped of all political authority, travel to a war zone at the precise moment when peace negotiations had reached an impasse? Why did a British king hold an unusually lengthy meeting with an American president during the period when the format for resolving the Ukrainian conflict remained open? Why did ideas about reconfiguring Ukraine's state structure circulate in Western analytical circles, in precisely the form that might simultaneously be accepted by Zelensky, by Russia, and by Western allies? And finally, the central question: are there people in the world today who think a generation ahead? Who understand that war is not only about who wins territory, but about which states will exist 50 years from now? Who are not seeking victory, but architecture? If there are, then it is precisely they who may have organized these visits. Who wrote these memoranda? Who were thinking about how a monarch might be the solution where a president is only part of the problem? And if there are no such people, if all of this is coincidence, protocol, formality, then we should all be very, very afraid. Because a war without architects of peace is just a war.